Hey guys, my name is Jesse and today we're reviewing the Grizzly sliding table saw. It's the G0623x model. It's 10-inch, 5 horsepower, 230 volt slider. Let's do it. Alright, so let's show you how the basics of how this works and its pros and cons, alright? So here we have the crosscut fence. You slide this over to the edge of the slider, right? This is the sliding unit. If you're going to be doing crosscut, you use this crosscut fence. There is two positions for it. You have it in the back here, or you can put it in the front. You have 90-degree stops for the front position. You can't see it, but there's one back here. One of the cons of this setup is moving it from the rear position to the front position. Kind of just seems more complicated, a little more not so great that it could have been. So, for example, I'll show you real quick, right? So you can have a knob down here with a washer. Take it off, you got the washer, you got the threaded knob. Then you kind of have to pry up on it. You got this little knob here which sits in a hole back here. And then you got to move it forward, line them both up. And then you got to thread the washer up onto the threaded rod here. And you got to thread the knob onto the rod. You can see, it would have been just easier if they did kind of like a router fence design where there was two threaded pieces that you could just loosen and then slide back and forth. But they didn't. So if you're cutting panels, it's recommended to have the fence in the front. It just gives you more area to work on back here as opposed to having the fence in the rear position. So the rear position is where I typically have it for using cross cuts on lumber. Since I mostly make furniture, I'm typically using dimensional lumber, and I'll break down my plywood sheets with a track saw on that side of my shop, which allows me to use the fence, crosscut fence in the rear position for broken down panels. If you're trying to break down a full sheet, it's a little tough on this model, but if you are going to do that, you want the fence here in this front position. So I'm going to put it back here in the rear position. And again, one of the cons to this setup is it's just not as easy as it could be. You're fighting against gravity to get this washer up on the threaded rod, hold it there while then trying to not cross-thread it. Again, it's not horrible, but it just seems like it could have been better. Like right now, I'm struggling with it. Come on, please. What it taught me is to better batch my parts, so I'm not constantly switching back and forth. So I guess there's one pro to it. So once you get it threaded on there before you tighten it down, another con is that this fence has a basically measurements here, increments of an inch, or I guess I should say 1/16 of an inch. You slide this around so you get nice repeated cross cuts. But the thing is that you can slide this, right? So no longer is this 4-inch mark 4 inches from there. So I get a little confused because it's almost like the measurement here is with this black piece getting cut by the saw, which I'm not a huge fan of. So I always just line it up to the edge of the slider, which gives me about 1/8 of an inch clearance from the blade. And what I'll do when I'm setting up the stops anyways, I will measure and mark. I'll get the cut and then I'll set this to that. So I don't really use this too much. I use this as a reference to get close. But otherwise I'm actually just kind of making my cut with a mark and then setting the block up there. One of the cool things too, another way you can use the fence here for a stop block is you can do this. Setting it down. and then you can use that. So you can basically get rid of this, do your cuts. Boom, and then make your cut. When you slide it up against it again, make your cut. So that's a pretty cool setup there. Another thing you can do here, depending on the kind of just the amount of room you have, is move the sliding section and the crosscut section separately. Now, if you were doing a larger piece, like trying to break down a full sheet, this is how you would do it. You would then move this up here, slide this piece down here. You would also fully extend this out to 79 inches. But what you'll notice is this is kind of flimsy. So when I first got this and I broke down a full sheet, I wasn't too confident with it. The cuts were pretty rough. So I found it was easier to actually just break it down with a track saw and then bring out, the two halves or whatever, the two sections, and then break it down on here even more. So typically I'm running it against dimensional lumber. So I'll have it like, I'm gonna have it like this, go halfway through. Then I can just kind of walk my cuts. That's another nice feature of the saw, it's much safer, or at least I feel like it is, because instead of being, right up here with a miter gauge running my cuts through, I'm all the way over here at times, making my cuts away from the blade. So that's a really cool feature. One of my other con to the saw is the power switch is down here. So once you have a piece of wood on here, you have to reach under and turn it on. If you have a full sheet or a large sheet on here, it makes getting under there, because you're going to have to be able to clear the blade with it. And now you have a panel on here, and the power switch is under there. So you'll have to reach way down here, get it, and turn it on. I'm not a huge fan of that. Once you make the cut, it's nice because it's right there, boom, you can turn it off. But turning it on is pretty sketchy, or at least uncomfortable having to reach under there and turn it on. So I'm going to get you guys up close to this so you can kind of see a little bit. So this is from the angle of operation. You can see here, this is the 90-degree stop for the crosscut fence here. This is the measurements, the reference here that I was talking about. But these aren't accurate because you'll see that I can have this in different areas, right? So the blade is against this kind of plastic piece here, which is going to cut it. And then next time I go to set it up, there's a little bit of material removed. So it's just something that doesn't really make sense to me. I haven't really figured it out yet. So I'll actually just put this basically flush with the edge of the sliding portion here. Make sure this is tight against the 90-degree stop, and then you'll tighten your knob down. And what I was talking about earlier was, say I need to make a 10-inch crosscut. Instead of bringing the stop block to 10 inches and saying, hey, boom, there's my 10 inches, what I will do is I'll measure 10 inches on here, mark it, I'll lift this up, I'll make my cut, and now that's 10 inches. Then what I would do is say, okay, boom, that's where my stop block needs to be. And really it would be whatever. This is obviously an exaggeration because I didn't actually make the cut, but I hope you get the idea on how I do that. Now there's times where I'll use the fence here as a stop block as well to make, maybe I have a longer piece and I'm making shorter cuts. So it would make more sense to have more stability along here and butting this against there to make my cuts. So it really just kind of depends on the application. Once you have the saw and you're using it, you would see what I mean, where I say, okay, it's better to use this as a stop block as opposed to this, because maybe of the room that you have, maybe the piece of lumber you have, the length of the cut you need, different things like that. You'll realize, hey, it's better for me to use the saw in this orientation for this type of cut, right? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and actually do some cuts for you so you guys can see how clean of a cut this is. This is a Freud 60-tooth blade. I believe it's a combo blade made for mostly cross-cutting plywoods and hardwoods. But because this slider, most sliders have this, it has a scoring blade here This is actually cutting a very small amount into the piece, which basically eliminates tear out. So let me go ahead and show you. So this is a piece of ash. I'm going to go ahead and cross cut this. I'll cross cut also a piece of plywood as well, so you can see how clean of a cut that is. So you can see here, there is no tear out on here whatsoever. If I could somehow show you, that'd be great. Now, one of the things you'll notice is the scoring blade is actually moving over a little bit away from where the main blade is. Why can't this just stay focused? But you can see here, you can see there's that line. So that's something I actually got to look into. If you cut on the right side of the blade, opposite of what I'm doing now, then you won't get this problem. So I assume that's just a simple alignment, but you can see how clean of a cut that is. So let's cut a piece of plywood now. You have a height adjustment for the scoring blade, so if you don't want to be using it, you can get rid of it. There are times where I've gotten rid of it because if you're doing a thin piece of wood, sometimes what happens, and especially if it's long, is the scoring blade while it's running will actually pull the piece out of your hand a little bit. So I'll make an angled cut on the piece of wood, which will potentially show on the final piece. So I've had times where that has completely ruined a piece of wood for me, where I then have to, go and get more wood to do some cuts. So this is, I'm going to do a cross cut on here, so the grain's actually running this way. So you'll see here, it's convenient where I can kind of just walk down against that fence and make my cut. All right, so since this plywood is running the cross grain, the grain was running like this. For me to do a cross cut, I have to go like this. A little bit sketchy with most table saws, especially if you're using a miter gauge. But because I have so much area down here with the fence, and because it's sliding on the table itself, I got to keep this piece stationary. And I'll be using my micro jig here, gripper, to hold it down. So here's the plywood that I just cross-cut. This is the top side. This is 1/2 inch maple from Lowe's. Nothing amazing by any means. Not horrible either though. But you can see there was some little bit of fibers out here on the top of the cut. But realistically, that's nothing. That's very minimal. And then here is the bottom of the cut, where it was scored before it was cut. There's the scoring blade, and then there's obviously the main blade. And you can see how clean of a cut that makes. So regarding my overall thoughts on the Grizzly G0623x, 10-inch, 5 horsepower, 220 volt, sliding table saw, I highly recommend it. Like I said, my only complaints was the on-off location and the kind of the tedious method of how this sliding cross-cut section is maneuvered. But other than that, I don't have any complaints. Plenty of power, nice and accurate from the factory. Assembling it was easy. The fact that this slider was parallel to the blade, was parallel to the fence from the factory, was a huge time saver, which was awesome. I've also had great customer service from Grizzly, as I accidentally opened this cover here and didn't realize I never closed it, and the table saw does not turn on if that is open, which is actually a nice safety feature because you've got to open that when working on the blade. But once I called and they walked me through it, immediately realizing what my problem was. They've just been great customer service on my other products that I've ordered from them as well. So I highly recommend the table saw. If you have any questions, let me know, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. But I hope you guys enjoyed this painfully awkward review of my hip.